Okay, so in this video I basically just want to explain to you the basic structure of the RangedCombatLab. We're going to ignore all of the movements and camera and sound and stat effects, and instead we're going to focus on how you go from the input over the inventory through the combat scripts and projectile scripts and ranged weapon scripts to the actual ranged combat in the end. So I created these two structures here, this one and this one, just to guide you a bit in this video and explain things to you. I will also upload them as PDF files so you can have a closer look. So yeah, check the description for that. But before I start jumping into the code, I actually want to talk about the two main types of scripts that I'm using in this RangedCombatLab. So we have data scripts and then we have player scripts. And this is simply because usually it would make the most sense to have like a ranged weapon class. For example, this would be this one here, to have like a ranged weapon class, and then this ranged weapon would have a function, I don't know, like public void fire. And then, one sec, that would fire the ranged weapon. But there's a couple problems with this, because since this is a scriptable object, and it has to be a scriptable object because you want to be able to do this in Unity and have it stored as a scriptable object and saved, the data should be saved, right? And so it needs to be a scriptable object, but then you don't have access to, you have access to instantiate, okay, but for example, start coroutine just doesn't exist, and invoke also doesn't exist, because these are functions specifically of the mono behavior. So the script would need to derive from mono behavior and not from scriptable object. And so the way I handle it is that I have data scripts that are specifically used to store data, like the ranged weapon, for example. And then I have player scripts that are specifically used to play this data, to turn this data into actual gameplay. And yeah, this is the main thing you need to understand. You'll find that most of my scripts are either scriptable objects or mono behaviors, with some exceptions. But okay, let's have a look at this part of the structure now. So the input script, basically, it's quite simple. It just cycles through all of the keybinds defined, and then if input.getKeyDown or getKeyUp, the classical way of handling inputs, right? Then it basically calls functions from the inventory script. And yeah, there's also the number keys and the mouse wheel inputs. Basically, number keys and mouse wheel are used to switch between the weapons, and ability inputs are used to, play the abilities. And then, as you can see here, all of this input is passed on to the inventory script. And then the main part of the inventory script is, first of all, to store all of the weapons and abilities the player currently has equipped. And you can actually change them in, this is also where you change the weapons, right? For example, this would be the weapon hotbar, and now I can add one and just choose which ability to add. And yeah, abilities contain weapons, by the way, or can contain weapons. And then the main usage of the inventory script is this try play ability function. So basically, we're just performing a couple checks whether or not this ability can be played. So first of all, if it even exists, if the hands needed are available, if the weapon is reloading, and things like that. And if all of these checks pass, then the inventory script passes the ability on to the player ability script. And I'll get to this script later, but first let's have a bit of a look at the rest of the inventory script. And you can basically understand it just by looking at the headlines here. It's handling all of the weapon equipping and unequipping, for example. It has a function called stop weapon fire that is called, for example, when you run out of ammo, so the weapon just doesn't continue shooting. and then it also has the magazine player. So as I explained before, the magazine would be a data script, and the magazine player would be a player script, or in this instant, it's a part of the inventory script. And you can see how all of these functions take in magazines. For example, start reload, partial reload, fully reload, add ammo, subtract ammo, and so on. And then the rest of the inventory script is not really needed. It's the old item system. I will add some kind of item system in the future, but for now, I pretty much deleted it. So then moving on to the abilities, basically, this is how the abilities are structured. So the idea I had here, or the reason why I'm making this so complex, is that in the end, you can define an ability, and that ability can contain movement actions, ranged actions, melee actions, and all kind of camera, sound, animation, and stat effects. So you have one ability class that can contain pretty much any gameplay element you could imagine. So basically, the ability class contains effects and actions, and those are the actions that are available, and those are the effects. Or, to be honest, movement actions and melee actions are not yet available, but they will be once I release the melee lab and the update for the movement lab. Now, it's important to note that all of these are scriptable objects and data only. So these are all data. And then the ability player, the effect player, and the action player, and all of these scripts are used to actually play this data or turn this data into gameplay. So the way this works is, here you have the ability class with the weapon, shortcut, the actions, and the effect playlist, which is really just a list of effects. And then they get passed on into the player ability script. And here you have the general play ability function, and this just checks if the ability is in cooldown, and if not, it stores the needed data and starts the ability cycle. And inside of the ability cycle, basically all of the actions and effects get passed on to either the action player or the effect player. So the actions get passed on to the action player here, and in play actions, the action player then takes these actions and passes them further onwards to the dedicated scripts. So for example, ranged actions get passed on to the combat script. And as said, melee and movement actions are not yet implemented. But for example, the effects player script, here's where the effects get passed in. And you have this play effect function, and it just checks, is it a camera effect, sound effect, animation effect, or stat effect, and then it plays it. Now, animation and sound aren't really implemented in this way right now. You can use sound directly from the weapon, but I'll implement this in further updates. But the stat effects are, and the camera effects are getting passed onwards to the player cam script. Okay, so now that you've hopefully understood how this ability system generally works, how the abilities are structured, and how one ability player passes it on to the effect and action player, and they pass it on to more different scripts, let's move on to the actual combat scripts and combat data classes. So the main one, of course, being the ranged weapon. So I'm not going to go through all of the variables, because there will be dedicated tutorials explaining you how to use all of these different variables. But generally, the ranged weapon script, as I told you already, just stores the data for the ranged weapons. Now moving on to the most important script, the combat script. This is the script that handles all of the projectile spawning. So basically, the main functions that you need to understand here is play ranged weapon, and then the following functions like execution cycle and ranged weapon cycle. And basically, it takes a ranged weapon and it plays it. Sorry, my microphone just dropped. So it takes the weapon and starts the ranged weapon cycle with it. And then this really just goes through the states of charging, executing, and cooldown. And when it's on executing, it starts the execution cycle. And inside of the execution cycle, it calls spawn projectile for the amount of projectiles that need to be spawned for the weapon ammo fire amount. And then spawn projectile, I'm not going to go through all of these functions. They are relatively self-explanatory. Basically, they do exactly what their names say. So first of all, you calculate the spawn point, you calculate the force direction with spread, then you rotate it to use the vertical angle. For example, grenade launchers use that. Then you instantiate the projectile, calculate the acceleration, add the force, and then you send the information to the projectile. And I will talk about this later. But for now, this is just the full spawn projectile cycle. And then basically it spawns it in the right spawn point. This can also be in a line or from all kinds of different direction. It gives it the force with spread. And then the rest of the combat logic is handled by the projectile. And you can see this here a bit. So you have the combat action on the ranged weapon class that gets passed onto, I think I changed the naming a bit here, but ultimately it gets passed onto the player combat script. And the projectile is the thing that then gets spawned and that also deals damage to the enemies. And as you've probably noticed by now, it's using these add-ons that you can add. And yeah, they're basically the heart of the RangedCombatLab, all of these scripts. So the projectile script, and I might go into this in a bit more detail in a different tutorial, but this is really just about the structure. So basically, it just takes in a lot of information that is needed for all of this to work, because, well, if the projectile connects with an enemy, for example, it needs to know from where the damage was coming and what the initial velocity was and things like that. And then there's not so much going on in this projectile script. Basically, it's just checking for collisions and trigger enters. And there's also raycast hit detections that are used for the laser. And then it has this check collision function, which basically just checks if it collided with an enemy and damages it. And now basically this is just one part of the projectile. The main functionality from projectiles comes from add-ons that you add to them. To show this in Unity, for example, let's go to the pre-made projectiles like the explosive. And you can see how it has the projectile script here and then the explosive script as an add-on on top of it. So this would be, for example, the explosive script. And here is all of the explosion logic defined. And it basically just has an explode function. And then this function is called from the projectile script on collision. And yeah, this is basically the main structure of the RangedCombatLab. To summarize it all, in the end, you have the input script that passes the inputs onto the inventory script. The inventory then checks if the ability can be played. If it can, the ability is passed on to the player ability script, and then to the actions out of this ability are passed on to the action player script, and the action player script then passes them on to the combat script. And the combat script in the end just spawns the projectile and shoots it forward, and the projectile basically just flies forward and then checks for collisions, and all of the add-ons change the behavior of the projectile. I hope this makes at least a bit of sense. I will be honest, my commentary skills are not the greatest, so I'm sorry if the explanations were a little bit weird at points. I just don't have the time to write an entire video script for each of these tutorials, so I'm kind of freestyling them a bit. I hope you did learn something and understand how the structure works, and feel free to ask questions in the comments, and I will upload these files as PDFs, and hopefully they help you a bit to understand how the Ranged Combat Lab works in the end. But yeah, make sure to also check out the other tutorials on this channel. They're going to be a bit more practical, not so much theory, but showing you actually how to create a ranged weapon that you can then use. And yeah, I'll end the video with playing in my beautiful chess world that I created for a short that is coming out today, I think. For you it should be coming out today. And yeah, you'll see this landscape again there. Okay, so thanks for watching. Hope it helped you.